In the heart of a quiet rural area, where the hills stretch out like a rolling green carpet and the sound of birdsong is the soundtrack of daily life, lived a farmer named Thomas. Thomas was a simple man, with sun-weathered skin and hands calloused from hard work. He had inherited the small farm from his parents and, over the years, transformed it into a haven of peace and prosperity. His crops were abundant, and the animals he raised were treated with all the care and respect he could offer. However, Thomas's life, though tranquil, was marked by a silent loneliness. A widower for a few years, he filled his days with work, trying to drown out the emptiness he felt since his wife, Eliza, had passed away. The days on the farm followed a steady rhythm, and although he was respected and loved by his neighbors, the loneliness of the night always found him. But, just as the sun rises after the darkest night, fate was about to place something extraordinary in his path. On a cold and damp autumn morning, as Thomas prepared his first cup of coffee, an unusual sound caught his attention. It was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, that seemed to come from the front door. Curious, he approached, cautiously opening the door. What he saw there, on the porch of his house, left him speechless. Before him, curled up and trembling, was a fox. It was not just any fox. Her eyes shone with a desperate intensity, and she was holding something fragile in her mouth. At the fox's feet, 3 small cubs were huddled together, their tiny heads lifting from time to time, as if seeking some comfort they couldn't find. Thomas stood still, his heart beating faster. He knew the wild animals of the region well and knew that a fox would never approach a human unless it was in an extreme situation. That encounter was something he never expected, something that seemed to transcend the simple interaction between man and nature. The fox, still with her eyes fixed on Thomas, gently released the small cub she was holding. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something deep passed between them. It was as if the fox was pleading for help, a silent request that Thomas, despite his surprise, couldn't ignore. Thomas slowly knelt, trying not to scare the animal any further. His eyes moved from the cubs to the fox, noticing that she was injured. There was a deep cut on her flank, and blood stained her reddish fur. She was clearly in a weakened condition, probably too exhausted to continue caring for her young. Moved by an empathy he hadn't known he possessed, Thomas made a gentle gesture, indicating that she could trust him. With an expression of pain and fatigue, the fox retreated a bit but didn't flee. Instead, she watched as Thomas, with all the care in the world, picked up one of the cubs in his hands. It was a tiny creature, so small it fit in the palm of his hand. The little animal trembled, and Thomas could feel the fragile warmth of its body against his skin. He looked at the fox, who continued to watch him, and felt a responsibility he had never felt before. Without hesitation, he picked up the other 2 cubs, carrying them into his house. The fox, visibly exhausted, slowly followed, stopping occasionally to catch her breath. She was placing her trust in this man who, until a few minutes ago, had been a complete stranger. Inside the house, Thomas improvised a small nest with blankets and hay, where he placed the cubs. The fox lay down beside them, letting out a heavy sigh, as if she could finally rest. Thomas knew he needed to act quickly. The fox's condition was critical, and he couldn't leave her like this. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, and he needed it fast. What he didn't know was that this moment would be the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever, a journey that would reveal the incredible connection that can exist between humans and animals, and how, sometimes, the simplest acts can have the most profound impact. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest as he observed the fox's condition. He knew that time was against him. The wound on her flank seemed worse than he had imagined, and although she was bravely fighting to stay by her cubs, her strength was quickly fading. The farmer wasn't a veterinarian, but he knew enough about animals to understand that if he didn't act soon, the fox might not survive to see her cubs grow up. He quickly improvised a small area in the corner of his kitchen, where he placed the warmest blankets he had, creating a kind of bed for the fox and her cubs. Then, he ran to his phone. In that rural area, veterinary emergencies weren't easily accessible, but he had a contact who could help. The local veterinarian, Dr. Emily, was known for her compassion and skill with all kinds of animals. She was always willing to help, even in the most challenging situations. Thomas dialed the number, and after a few rings, heard Emily's warm voice on the other end. He quickly explained the situation, feeling the urgency increase with every word. "She needs help, Emily." "She and the cubs? I don't know how much longer she can hold on." On the other end of the line, Emily listened intently and, without hesitation, responded, "I'm on my way, Thomas. Keep her comfortable and try to keep the cubs warm. I'm bringing everything I can to help." While he waited, Thomas turned his attention back to the fox. She was lying down, her breathing slow and heavy, but her eyes remained fixed on him. It was as if she was entrusting her life and that of her cubs to this strange human. The small cubs nestled beside their mother, seeking the warmth she offered, even though she was too weak to move. Thomas felt a wave of emotion sweep through his body. It wasn't just compassion, it was something deeper, a connection he had never felt before. He knew that, somehow, this fox had chosen his home, chosen him, to protect what was most precious to her. And he would not fail her. When Emily finally arrived, she brought a small first aid kit and a determined look. She was a young woman, but her expression denoted experience and seriousness. Without wasting any time, she began to examine the fox, who didn't resist. The fox's trust in Thomas seemed to extend to Dr. Emily as well, and she allowed Emily to work without a fight. "She's gravely injured," Emily said after a few minutes. "I'll need to clean and suture this wound and give her some antibiotics. I can't promise anything, Thomas, but I'll do my best." Thomas simply nodded, unable to find the words. He watched as Emily worked with precision and care, cleaning the fox's wound and applying the necessary medication. The process seemed painful, but the fox held firm, as if she knew it was necessary for her survival. During the procedure, Emily looked at Thomas and said, "It's incredible that she came here. Foxes are extremely independent creatures and rarely approach humans like this. She must have traveled a long distance with these cubs, which only shows how desperate she was." Thomas didn't respond immediately, but his hands were clenched in fists of anxiety. The idea that the fox was so desperate that she trusted a human was both painful and moving. He wondered what could have happened to bring her to this situation, but he knew he would never have a clear answer. All he could do now was ensure she got the help she needed. After what seemed like hours, Emily finally finished. The fox was exhausted, but her wounds were clean and treated, and the cubs were safe beside her. "Now, all we can do is wait," Emily said softly. "She needs to rest and regain her strength. Hopefully, she'll be fine, but the first step is making sure she feels safe here." Thomas thanked Emily for her tireless work, and she promised to return the next day to check on the fox's recovery. After she left, Thomas turned his attention to the fox and her cubs. They were sleeping, finally at peace, at least for now. As night fell, Thomas realized that the farm, which once seemed so quiet and lonely, was now filled with a new energy. It was as if that little fox family had brought new life to the place. And although he didn't know what the future held, one thing was certain: he would do everything in his power to protect those little beings, just as they trusted him to do. He settled into a nearby chair, determined to keep watch through the night, ready to help if necessary. And as the stars shone in the dark sky, he made a silent promise to the fox and her cubs: they were safe here, and he would fight with all his strength to ensure they remained so. The night was long and quiet on Thomas's farm. He kept his vigil, sitting beside the fox and her cubs, the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth being the only source of warmth and light in the small space. As the minutes dragged on, he found himself reflecting on the strange twist his life had taken in such a short time. What initially seemed like an ordinary day in the monotonous routine of a lonely farmer had turned into something profoundly significant. With each heavy breath the fox took, Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. He was emotionally invested in a way he had never anticipated. That animal and her cubs were not just wild creatures on his property, they were beings that had placed their last hope in his hands. And that changed something inside him, something he could barely comprehend. Dawn arrived slowly, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. With the sunlight came a new breath of hope. Thomas rose from his chair, feeling his muscles stiff and sore after a sleepless night, and walked to the window, gazing at the horizon. He knew he had to keep acting, that the fight for those little lives was far from over. Determined to ensure they had everything they needed to survive, Thomas prepared a warm broth with the few ingredients he had in the kitchen. He knew the fox wouldn't have much appetite, but the liquid might help her regain some strength. He carefully poured a small amount of the broth into a shallow dish and brought it to the fox's side. She opened her eyes slowly, and Thomas could see the pain and exhaustion in her gaze. But there was also something else, a quiet determination, a survival instinct that kept her there, fighting. Thomas brought the dish closer to her mouth, hoping she would accept the food. With slow and hesitant movements, the fox began to lap up the broth, at first with reluctance, but soon with a bit more vigor. It was a small progress, but to Thomas, it was a sign that there was hope. By noon, Emily returned to the farm, as promised. Her expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of optimism in her eyes as she examined the fox again. "She's a fighter," Emily said as she checked the sutures and the wounds she had treated the night before. "If she can survive the next few days, I think she might fully recover." Thomas felt a momentary relief, but he knew the battle was far from won. He helped Emily administer more antibiotics to the fox and ensured that the cubs were well fed and warm. With each gesture, he felt more connected to that little family, as if a part of his own heart was becoming intertwined with the fate of those animals. Then, on the third day after the fox's arrival, something extraordinary happened. Thomas was on the porch of the house, chopping wood for the fire, when he heard a faint, almost inaudible sound coming from the nearby forest. It was a sound he didn't recognize at first, but it made him stop what he was doing. He put down the axe and stood still, trying to identify what it was. The sound came again, this time a little louder. It was a sad and desperate cry, a high-pitched wail that cut through the air with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Without hesitation, Thomas dropped everything and ran toward the source of the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally reached the edge of the forest, the scene he found left him paralyzed. There, in a small clearing, was another fox cub, even smaller than the three he had already rescued. It was alone, trembling from the cold, its eyes closed as if on the verge of succumbing to exhaustion and hunger. Thomas knew instantly that this was the cub the mother had lost during her desperate journey to his home. Without a second thought, he knelt down and picked up the cub in his hands, feeling its small, fragile, and cold body. The cub let out a weak sound, almost like a whimper, and Thomas felt his heart break completely. "I found you," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "I found you, little one. You're going to be okay now." With the cub safe in his arms, Thomas ran back to the house as fast as he could. When he entered, the fox lifted her head with effort, her eyes widening when she saw the fourth cub she thought she had lost forever. Thomas, still out of breath, placed the cub with its siblings, and the mother immediately began to clean it with her tongue, her weak but determined body now protecting all four of her cubs. That moment was a turning point for Thomas. He realized that there was something greater at play, something beyond his understanding. That fox had trusted him to protect her cubs, and now, with them all reunited, he knew it was no coincidence. Thomas felt a wave of emotion wash over him, and in that instant, he made a promise to himself and to that brave mother. He would do everything in his power to ensure they all survived and thrived. With this new purpose firmly rooted in his heart, Thomas knew the battle for those animals' lives was far from over. But he also knew he was no longer alone. He had become part of that family, and together, they would face whatever came their way, relying on the strength they had found in each other. In the days that followed, Thomas's farm transformed into a true sanctuary of recovery and hope. The fox, now with her four cubs reunited, began to show signs of improvement. Her strength was slowly returning, and each new day, she could move a little more, care for her cubs with more vigor, and even attempt to get up and explore her surroundings. Each small progress of the fox was like a ray of light in Thomas's life, dispelling the shadows of his loneliness. He felt deeply connected to her and her cubs, as if they were an extension of his own soul. He had completely devoted himself to that little family, caring for them with a love and dedication he didn't even know still existed within him. With each gesture, with each look of gratitude he received from the fox, Thomas felt a renewal in his spirit, as if that simple task of caring for them was what he most needed to fill the void that life had left in his heart. Emily continued to visit the farm daily, monitoring the fox's health and ensuring she was receiving the proper care. Each time she left, she would encourage Thomas, reminding him that he was doing an extraordinary job, something that few would be capable of accomplishing. But what she didn't say, and what perhaps Thomas didn't realize, was how much he himself had changed. The man who once seemed resigned to a life of silence and routine now radiated a new energy, a new reason to wake up each day. As time passed, the cubs began to grow, their little legs becoming sturdier, and their playfulness more daring. They started exploring Thomas's kitchen, stumbling over their own paws as they ventured across the wooden floor. And with each new milestone, the first firm step, the first time they managed to climb a small obstacle, Thomas was deeply moved, his eyes welling up as he watched those little beings who, against all odds, had found safety and love under his roof. But as much as these moments brought joy to Thomas's heart, he knew that a painful decision lay ahead. The fox was recovering well, and the cubs were growing strong. Soon, they would be ready to return to the wild, to live the life that was destined for them. And although the thought of parting with them squeezed his heart in an almost unbearable way, Thomas knew he couldn't keep them there forever. The day of farewell came sooner than he expected. On a clear morning, Emily made her routine visit and, after examining the fox and the cubs, looked at Thomas with a sad but understanding smile. "Thomas," she began, "I think it's time. They're ready. The mother fox has recovered very well, and the cubs are now strong enough to start learning to live in the wild." Those words fell like a stone in Thomas's heart. He knew this day would come, but that didn't make it any less painful. Looking at the cubs, who were now playing carelessly near the fireplace, he found himself fighting back tears. How could he let go of those who, for a brief period, had become his family? The pain was so real, so palpable, that he felt as if he were losing a part of himself. "I know it's best for them," Thomas replied, his voice choked with emotion. "But it's going to be hard to let them go." Emily placed a comforting hand on Thomas's shoulder, and he felt the warmth of the gesture pass through his body like a silent consolation. "You've done more for them than anyone could have done. You gave them a chance at life, and now it's time to let them go their way. But I know they'll never forget what you did for them." That afternoon, with a heavy heart, Thomas and Emily took the fox and her cubs to the nearby forest, where nature awaited them. Thomas carried the cubs in a small improvised box, and the fox walked beside him, her eyes watchful and full of wisdom. When they reached a serene clearing, surrounded by tall trees and sheltered from the winds, Emily suggested that this would be the ideal spot. With tears in his eyes, Thomas knelt down and, one by one, took the cubs out of the box, gently placing them on the leaf-covered ground. The little ones looked around, confused, but soon began to explore the new environment with curiosity. The fox, for her part, looked at Thomas one last time before moving closer to her cubs, encouraging them to follow her into the forest. And there, in that moment of farewell, Thomas felt something inside him break and, at the same time, heal. It was as if the pain of letting them go was also the release of an old wound he had carried in his chest. He knew he was doing the right thing, but the house would feel incredibly empty without that little family he had cared for with so much love. He raised his hand in a gesture of goodbye, even though he knew the fox might not understand, but in his heart, he felt there was a mutual understanding between them, something that transcended words or gestures. "Take good care of them," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Take good care of your little ones." The fox stopped at the edge of the clearing and, surprisingly, looked back one last time. Her eyes met Thomas's, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though she was truly saying goodbye, acknowledging all that he had done for her and her cubs. And then, with one final graceful movement, she disappeared into the forest, taking her cubs with her. Thomas stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where they had vanished, feeling the tears finally stream down his face. Emily remained silent by his side, understanding the weight of that moment. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath and turned, beginning the walk back home. The forest was quiet now, but in his heart, he carried the sound of little paws, grateful gazes, and the memory of a bond that transcended the barriers between man and nature. That night, Thomas sat on the porch, gazing at the starry sky. He knew that this experience had changed his life forever. The loneliness that had accompanied him for years seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a deep sense of connection with the world around him. He had found a new understanding of life, one that taught him that even in the most unexpected moments, there is a greater beauty and purpose in our actions. And with that, Thomas finally found the peace he had long sought, a peace that came from an unexpected place but now filled every corner of his soul. The days that followed were marked by a new and comforting calm in Thomas's life. The farm, which once echoed the solitary silence of his thoughts, now seemed full of living memories. He found himself smiling to himself as he remembered the little cub's antics, the fox's determined gaze, and how those moments, so simple yet so profound, had changed everything. Thomas continued with his routine on the farm, but now, each task seemed imbued with a new meaning. The fresh milk he churned, the crops he tended with such care, even the sound of the wind passing through the trees, all seemed connected to something greater, something he couldn't explain but felt in every fiber of his being. He knew that the fox and her cubs were out there, living the life they were meant to live, and that brought him a sense of satisfaction and purpose he had never experienced before. And even though he sometimes missed them dearly, he knew he had done the right thing. He had helped them survive, and in return, they had shown him what it truly meant to live. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch with a cup of hot coffee, Thomas spotted something in the distance, at the edge of the forest. It was just a glimpse, but he knew what he had seen: the fox, standing among the trees, watching him from afar. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Thomas felt a wave of emotions, a mix of gratitude and silent understanding. She was fine, and so were her cubs. They had found their place in the world, just as he had found his. And as she turned and disappeared back into the forest, Thomas knew he would never feel alone again. There was a connection between him and that wild creature, a connection that transcended words and would endure for the rest of his life. At that moment, Thomas realized something that would forever change his outlook on life. Life is full of moments that, at first glance, may seem insignificant, but have the power to completely transform a person's heart and soul. And these transformations don't come from great deeds or achievements, but from simple gestures, from acts of kindness that connect living beings in ways we don't always understand. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with vibrant shades of orange and pink, Thomas smiled to himself. He had found something more valuable than any treasure, a purpose, an understanding that he was part of something greater, something beautiful and infinitely mysterious. And so, in that small farm, amidst the green hills and under the vast starry sky, Thomas finally found peace. He knew that, no matter what the future held, his heart would always be full of the memories and lessons that little fox family had given him. Life, he realized, was made of moments like those, moments of connection, of love, of sacrifice, and of hope. In the end, Thomas understood that each of us carries within ourselves the power to change the world, whether through great heroic acts or small gestures of kindness. And that sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places, showing us that the true purpose of life is to care for one another, whether human or animal, and to find joy in the simple existence of being alive.